material, but in a slightly different order. And there are some things that we didn't get to. So I will move a little bit faster so that we can get to those issues that we left out at the end. I'll remind you, I mentioned 3 books last week, and these are written by 3 very brilliant feminist, I want to say theologians, historians, right? Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza is at Harvard, wrote In Memory of Her, which is a great book for thinking about what we need to do to recover the feminine voices from the early church. The early church, as we move forward into 3rd, 4th century, those voices got silenced, right? And by the time the canon was chosen, the contents of the Bible, right, the only people involved in that choosing were the men, right? So as a result, every single document in our Bible is a document written by a man. Anyone that we can demonstrate where it came from a man, right? And so how do we deal with that if in the modern world we want to hear the women's voices as well? And so that's a fairly hefty book that goes through and looks at that problem and how we read these texts in a way that would help us to uncover what feminine perspectives would have been. Sometimes they're not directly addressed, but hinted at in the text, and so it takes some serious work. That's Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza. Laura Nasrallah, who is at Yale, right, has written a book called An Ecstasy of Folly that looks at the early Christian use of prophecy, right? Not the ancient prophets, but living people at the time who claimed to be prophets and were members of the early church. That also is a movement that got squashed. By the time you get up into 450, there are no prophets anymore, right? So what happened with that and why did it happen, right? Because in the early church, I mean, even Paul himself refers to the prophets. Let a couple of prophets speak about this issue, right? And he's acknowledging that they're there in the church. So what changed? Why did we end up with a theology that saw prophecy as something from the ancient world, but not now, right? And so we'll look at that. Her book is really helpful with that. When Women Were Priests by Karen Torgerson looks at the evidence that we have that women actually did hold the position of priest in the early church, in the early churches. What became the Catholic Church later, which had an all-male clergy, well, that took quite a while to develop. There was a period in the early church where it was not unheard of to go into a church and the person presenting the service is a woman, right? And so what happened to the leadership roles of women and why? Right, is this Karen Torgerson's book. So we will deal with some things today that none of them talk about, but they're really good reading for background of this issue. What happened to women's voices as the church became more institutionalized? And so I highly recommend them. We talked last week about the contrast between private space and public space in the Roman world. So I wanted to revisit that a little bit today, especially for the people at home who weren't able to see this last time. In Roman society, there was a ideological difference between what happens in public and what happens at home, right? And that has specific gender implications. Well, if I go in the right direction, what do you see? Karen Torgerson, in the book about women when women were priests, does a comparison like this: the public space, private space, right? And what the culture identified with those spaces. Public space is envisioned as a man's space. That's men. That's their domain out there, right? Private space in Roman society. This is the domain of the woman. And so the woman runs the household, if you will. I mentioned last time that there were women who owned major businesses in the ancient world, and it was fine in the time because they were run out of the household. Right, and so she's in charge of what's happening in the household, and so is a center of power for women. The household is much more than just the place where they sleep at night. Right, the family business is run out of there, and so you have women in some powerful roles economically, but based in the home, right, in private space. So you have a contrast between public spaces outdoor. Private spaces indoor. Think about where's the theater in the ancient Roman world? What kind of structure is that? Oh, it's an outdoor space, right? And so you have exactly. So public events are in outdoor spaces. They're in the marketplace. They're in the amphitheater, right? This is outdoor space. It's public. Private space is indoor. It's enclosed. It has walls. It has a defined space, a roof over the top, right? It's enclosed. You can talk about that same distinction in terms of boundless space or bounded space, right? Space that's clearly defined. Outdoor public space is mobile. It can be moved. A public meeting in the marketplace can move to the amphitheater. You can just do whatever you need. It can move, but the house doesn't move. The house is where it is, and it's stationary. Another distinction that seems foreign to us is the distinction between civilized and natural. Right? We think of civilized versus uncivilized. Right? But in the ancient Roman thinking, civilized was the opposite of natural. Natural is what the animals do, right? It's things happen, things, sex, for example, is natural, right? It happens, everything does that, right? That is in private space. See how it is? It's natural. It's in private space. Civilized, when you go out into the business world, people don't do that out there, right? They don't take care of their natural needs, right, out in public space. That's a difference. So you contrast public and private space, contrast in that sense as well. There's also a specific valuation. Public space is superior to private space. Now, if we think about this is a valuation that's strongly held in Roman society that's different from our society, precisely because of our difference of individual versus social thinking. Right? The state is in public space, right? And in the Roman way of thinking, the state is superior to the home. Right? The home is inferior, right, to the state. The state is public, the home is private, right? And so the public domain in Roman thinking is the superior domain. The private domain is inferior to that in their way of thinking. And so that's an important difference, I think, between their society then and our society today. Right? We tend to emphasize the individual. The family is more important than my commitment to the larger society. Right? Not in Roman way of thinking. Right? It's just the reverse. So this is a strong cultural point of view that will impact what happens to women's voices as we go forward. Let's think about what we talked about last week about the house church. The very first churches were not public buildings. They were private homes. Right? They were people's homes. We can see this even in the New Testament itself. Right? Look at this. This is from Philemon. Right? Paul writes, to Philemon, our dear friend and co-worker, to Apphia, our sister. You notice he's addressed the man and the woman right here. To our Archippus, our fellow soldier, and to the church in your house. Right? This is where the churches were meeting. If you think about it, in the earliest days of Christianity, it was very much a minority movement. The people, they were, in the very first days, they were all Jewish, right? They went to the synagogue on Saturday, the Sabbath, and then met on Monday to talk about Jesus and how Jesus related to all that, right? And that meeting happened in somebody's house. So you have the synagogue, the public space, and then the Christian space, the Christian celebration is in a private space. Right? And so even from the very earliest days. Now, as they move out into the Greco-Roman world, you're going to get heavy persecution of Christians. So are they going to be meeting in a large public space? No, right? They're going to be hiding in somebody's house, right? This is a private thing. The word of mouth goes from person to person. You invite them to somebody's house, to a safe place, a bounded place, right? A place with walls and protection, right? This is where the church meets in the ancient world. Even as they move out into the Greco-Roman world, that's going to happen because of the persecution, right? So in the first 200, 300 years of the church, they're meeting in people's homes, not in public buildings. And so church is private space, not public space, right? In that environment, there's absolutely no problem in the Greco-Roman way of thinking with women having strong controlling roles, right? In that, you might be in a house and the primary speaker is a woman in that house. It's her house, right? It's her domain, right? And so the strong leadership of women is not challenged by that space. Right. So so a couple of things about what we see and what all scholars notice about this early Christian movement. One, you have very strong leadership of women, right, in the first couple of centuries. And second, that there is an extremely strong commitment to pacifism, right? This is one of the causes of the persecution. Right? Why does the Roman Empire oppose Christianity? Well, the Christians refuse to bow down to the emperor, one. And when you're called before government, that's just a part of the deal. When you go into court, right, there's an image of the emperor, and you honor that image. Right? But the Christians won't do that. And so they get called into court, they get in trouble. But the other thing is they won't serve in the legions, right? When you conscript people, which the Roman army did all the time, is just go into a town and grab all the young men and you're now serving in the legions. There was no advance warning, right? But the Christians won't fight, right? They draw them into to the legions and they refuse to fight, right? This is unthinkable, right, from a Roman perspective. And so how can you do this? So there are reasons that Christianity comes to be heavily persecuted in the early days. That also is going to drive it into private space, right? That persecution. And so it's important to keep in mind that those values are there, and they're tied. That commitment to pacifism, that commitment to strong leadership from the women, right? It fits, right, within that space, that private space. Right? Let's talk about prophecy for a minute. This we did kind of down at the end last time, so I moved it up a bit to put it in chronological order, right? Because it was out of order last time, and we didn't get to deal with it very much. In the early Christian church, in the first couple of centuries, right, no one questioned the fact that there were living prophets in the Christian community. It was just a fact. Paul himself, right? Let's look at look at what Paul says. This is from 1 Corinthians, right? 1 Corinthians chapter 14 says, And God has appointed in the church first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, then deeds of power, then gifts of healing, forms of assistance, forms of leadership, various kinds of tongues. Are all prophets? Are all apostles? Are all prophets? Are all teachers? Do all work miracles? And so these are assuming that these things are happening, but Paul's saying not everybody has all of them. Like some people are apostles, some people are prophets, some people work miracles, some people are teachers, right? They have different roles. Not everybody does everything. Is the point he's making here. Let's see, let 2 or 3 prophets speak. He's talking about here what happens when they come together in someone's home to have to do the worship. Paul says, let 2 or 3 prophets speak and let others weigh what is said. And the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets. We're going to come back to that line in a minute. The spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets. Anyone who claims to be a prophet or to have spiritual powers must acknowledge that what I am writing to you is a command of the Lord. Right? So Paul is asserting authority over these prophets. Right? He said, if you claim to be a prophet, you got to acknowledge that what I'm saying here about the order in the service, that's a command of the Lord. It's not just a nice suggestion, right? What's he dealing with here, right? We know that in the early church, the fact that there are still people claiming to be prophets gets problematic. They don't all say the same thing, right? And so Paul seems to be trying to bring some order here. Just 2 or 3, don't have 8 people speaking, claiming to be prophets. 2 or 3, let 2 or 3 people speak, and then everybody else weigh what they said. Right? In other words, don't just accept it outright. Weigh it. Think about it. Okay? So Paul's acknowledging both that there are prophets in the early church, there are people who have that role, just like there are people who are apostles, that they're there, and that it can be a problem sometimes. And so we have to put some limits on it. Right? So as we go forward in the 1st century, the 2nd century, even the early 3rd century, there is more and more debate about this. What about those people? Right? How can we deal with it now? What should we be accepting them all the time? Should that be a constant part of our worship? Paul thought it should be. Right? But not everybody agrees as we're moving forward. So let's look at a little bit of why that happens here. Look at a few people. In the 2nd century, the early 100s, you notice the numbers are off a bit. The year 1 to 99 is the 1st century, right? 100 to 199 is the 2nd century. So Monmouth here is pretty early. This is early 100s, right? The 2nd century. He's a person who calls himself a prophet, right? But it's a little bit different from the Old Testament prophets. This is ecstatic prophecy. We know what that means. Somebody goes into, they seem to have become irrational. They have a fit. Sort of, they come out of that, and all of a sudden they're speaking, and everybody's like, "Whoa!" Right? What happened? This is what Monmouth is doing. Right? There's this element of ecstasy to it. This comes more from the Greek side than from the Hebrew side. This wasn't a typical feature of the Hebrew prophets, right? But it was a feature of the oracle at Delphi, for example. Right? And so in the Greco-Roman world, this is not uncommon at all. The prophets have they might use some substances to help them reach that level of ecstasy, and then the prophecy comes out. Right? And so there are a bunch of people in the early church who say, wait a minute, this is not our tradition. Right? It's prophecy, but it's got something mixed in that's not from where we're coming from. And so he becomes a controversial figure really fast. Right? And so you get this controversy in the early church whether that kind of prophecy is okay. Right? You have 2 other. Look at the other 3 people there in that list. Notice anything about what do those names sound like? Prisca or Priscilla?
A woman.
That's a woman.
She was the leader of the house church, wasn't she?
Yeah, and now we're up in the 2nd century now, so it's a different one, but that same name, it's a woman's name, right? And so you get her doing the same thing, and she becomes an ally of Montanus, right? Now, later, the early church is going to label this whole thing as Montanism and declare it a heresy, right? But it's not a unified movement. You have Montanus doing this, you have Priscilla doing this in another place, you have Maximilla, right, who also is an ecstatic prophet, right? A woman, yes. You go up into the 3rd century, you get Quintilla, right, also a woman, right? You see what's happening here, right? So these women's voices are getting expression through this issue of prophecy in the early church. And so even this is something that happens in public space. You see, this might happen in the marketplace, for example. Yes, and this is problematic. You see how this is from Roman culture? This is problematic. This is a problem. We have women doing this and speaking, in prophetic voice out in public. Now, the oracle at Delphi was also a woman, but she was within that temple. She didn't go out in the street, right? You see how this is. So this is problematic for the culture, right? And so you get this movement. So I pointed out over here in this box that later the church is going. One of the ways that they're going to deal with this is they're going to lump them all together. So they're all Montanists. Right, and they're going to accuse them of all kinds of things that probably aren't true at all, right? But they're going to connect them with immorality. They're going to connect them with bestiality. This is a typical Roman criticism that these people are like the beasts, right? That is natural, not civilized.
The witchcraft.
Right? What?
Witchcraft. Did they accuse them?
Not witchcraft in this case, but being like the beasts, right? Being natural in public, that's not okay, right? You see, so now we don't even know if they really actually did those things, right? But it's a part of the criticism hurled against them, right? In the attempt to stop them. One very early, very powerful early voice in favor of prophecy and even ecstatic prophecy is an early church leader named Tertullian. Anyone ever heard of him?
Unfortunately.
Yes, right. Now there are a lot of things about Tertullian that were very negative that we could go on about, but he wrote extensively about prophecy and about ecstasy. Right? And now one of his major works that all the scholars who study this period say, oh, we only had that because other people mentioned it, but we don't have a copy of it. Right? We have his works on the nature of the soul, for example. In that, he dedicates a large segment to this issue of ecstatic prophecy. And he argues this is divine. This is something of God, right? This is something that's an essential element of our tradition. When the church kind of invents this category of Montanism, they're going to lump Tertullian in.
Well, he said women are the gateway to hell.
Yeah, he did say some negative things about women. Yes, he did. And but the thing is, it's not because of their prophecy. You see, it's not because of that, right? He said this prophecy that God reveals himself this way, right? In prophecy, in the irrational, if you will. He even uses the term amentia. It's the way it gets expressed in Latin, right? In Greek, it's a bit different, but it doesn't have any connection with our English there. But we can kind of sense what that means. Amentia, it's mindless, if you will, right? That prophecy happens as when God takes over the Spirit, it speaks through us, right? And it's not necessarily a rational thing. Right?
Do you know if he had any women in his life, in his inner circle?
I really don't know. We know very, very little about his personal life. And this is the truth. We really don't know. There are a whole lot of things like that. What is family like that we just have to throw up our hands and we have no idea, right? And so because it didn't come down to us. But you notice the time here? He's living from about 155 to 220 in that area. And so even up into the early 200s, you have the 3rd century. You have a major voice. He is he's writing from Carthage. He's a major church leader in Carthage. And so you have a major church leader, even up into the early 200s, writing a defense of prophecy in the early church. Right? We'll come back to that issue. We're going to go in historical order here. And so there's something important that happens before we get Tertullian and the others squashed, right? And labeled as the Montanist heresy, right? Well, let's go through. Let's look at what happens when Christianity becomes legalized, right? By the way, you often hear that Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. That never, ever happened. Not during Constantine's lifetime. It became eventually the official religion of the Roman Empire, but not over 80 years later, after Constantine, right? What Constantine did do is make Christianity legal, right? The persecutions that were happening were intense when Constantine came on board. Constantine, in the middle of war, right? There's a 4-way struggle for control of the Roman Empire. Constantine is one of those 4. And in battle against the other leader in the West, by the way, a generation or 2 back, they had started a system of 4 emperors, right? There were 2 in the East, 2 in the West. Constantine is one of those in the West, right? And he begins to fight for control of the whole West against the other one in the West. And at a key moment, the other one, by the way, had control of the city of Rome. Constantine didn't, right? But Constantine is bringing his armies, right? And they get to the Milvian Bridge. It's a bridge outside Rome. And he camps for the night. And according to, we have 2 different writers who wrote about what happened that night, okay? They agree on the fact that Constantine had some kind of vision. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe it was a waking vision. We don't know, but something in which he hears this message, right? Have your soldiers paint the Tyro. Tyro, there's 2 Greek letters. It's the first 2 letters of the word Christ, right? Have them paint that on their shields and you will see victory. Well, Constantine's not a Christian, right? But he knows what this symbol means. Right? He wakes up the next day, has them do it, and they are victorious. What's this going to do to Constantine? Right? Yes, Constantine says, "Whoa, this worked!" Right? And so he's enthusiastic now. He embraces. He doesn't become an enthusiastic. He doesn't become somebody who goes to church every Sunday and does all that. But he meets up with one of the emperors from the East, right? They gather in Milan, and he issues something called the Edict of Milan. Let's see. Did I put that
Are you
in
sure
here?
he wasn't a Baptist?
What? What?
I think he was a Baptist.
Oh, he must have been. No, I didn't think. Okay, well, let's see, you did it. I may have left that out when I put it, yeah, I think I left that out but yeah, let's back up. When I converted over to a Google document, the Edict of Milan essentially says it's an edict of religious freedom. It's not just about Christianity. It says when we met in Milan, we agreed that everyone, including the Christians, right? So the Christians get mentioned specifically, but it's about everyone. Right? It says everyone, including the Christians, are to be able to worship the God of their choice, right? And so you get basically an edict of tolerance. We're not going to persecute people anymore because of the gods they worship or the ones they refuse to worship. right? And so now all of a sudden Christianity is legal, right? It's not persecuted anymore. Persecutions stop, happens to the Christian gatherings now. They move out into public space, right? Constantine even invests a large amount of money from the imperial treasury. Now, by the way, this is split. You have the Senate in Rome, which has its treasury, but the emperor has his own and has a huge amount of money. He begins to give money to build Christian churches, right? So these people have a public space to worship in. Right?
And they support Constantine.
Oh, wholeheartedly they support Constantine. Now, you notice something that I haven't even touched on, but it's just assumed has really changed in Christian thinking. Those earliest Christians in first and early second century were committed pacifists. For Constantine, Christ is the God of war. You see that's a radical difference, right? Over the intervening time, we're up in the 300s now, right? So the 4th century, over the intervening time, more and more Christians have been comfortable with serving in the legions. Right? So that extreme pacifism that was there in the 1st century, the early 2nd century, has waned considerably by the time you get to the 4th century. So when Constantine declares Christ to be his God of war, you get a lot of Christians who are comfortable with that. Right? They're okay with it. Right? Of course, Christ is powerful. Right? And power is expressed in military terms. Right? So you get this real shift in early Christian thought regarding violence. Right, the use of violence, and they're much more comfortable with the use of violence. And we're going to see that the church itself is going to become very militant over the next 500 years after this. And so we'll see what happens with that. So Christianity gets legalized with Constantine. What gender implications are pretty obvious here that are going to happen. When now it moves out of the home into public buildings, what's going to happen to women's leadership?
Institutionalization is not good for us.
Yeah, and public institutionalism in a Roman cultural setting, people who are perfectly okay with a woman being the priest, as long as it was in the house, are now really uncomfortable. They're in a public space, and there's a woman up there. Right? This doesn't feel right. By the way, those early churches that Constantine built looked amazingly similar to the court buildings. Right? Who was running the court in Rome?
The
Men were. All of them, right? Every single judge, they were all men. Right? And now you're in a place that looks just like that. And by the way, many scholars think that's where we got the notion of the pulpit, because there was one in the court. And so there's one in Constantine's churches. Right? You see how that is? And now the optics of this just look really disturbing to many people in the Christian community. This is like the court. What's she doing up there? Right? And so you get this pushback, this cultural pushback against women in leadership roles once you move into that space, right? And so it's something that's easy to understand when we understand how Roman society viewed public and private space, right? We have, by the way, some of those early church buildings to see, we can see this transition happening, because some of them have engraved, the ruins of them have engraved the names of the first 6 to 8 priests from that church, and their women's names in those lists. Right? So at first, even though it was in public space, women continued to have those roles. But there was more and more and more pushback against This doesn't look right, right? It's not, doesn't fit what we assume. And by the way, notice how our cultural assumptions are often very much stronger than our theology, right? That's always been the case. We assume that what our culture says okay is okay. And what our culture says is not okay is not okay, regardless of what our theology says. Right? And so here you get these Christian communities who begin to say, no, just sit down and be quiet. Right? Even Paul, in his letters, right? Now we have a passage in Paul where he specifically says that a woman's not supposed to speak in church, which is really bizarre if Paul actually wrote that, because Paul, in another of his letters, mentions several women and says they are my co-workers in the gospel. Right?
Is that in the Bible?
Yes. Right? In Paul, in Philippians. Huh? No. Yeah. He lists women in the letter to the Philippians, for example, by name, right? And says they are my co-workers in the gospel. Listen to them. Right? And so he clearly does not believe that women can't speak to church. But we have this weird passage in 1 Corinthians where he says, let the women be silent. And so scholars argue over, could Paul possibly have written that? Right? If he had co-workers who were doing the same kind of work he was doing, and he supported them, how could he write that? Right? And so you get a debate over whether, and it, by the way, it's like 2 sentences in Corinthians. And many scholars will say, I don't think Paul actually wrote this. I think that's a later addition, right? Because it just doesn't work with the rest of his letters, right? Where he clearly assumes women are leaders in the church, right? And so, so it would be really nice, I mentioned last time, if we actually had a manuscript of 1 Corinthians that lacked those 2 verses, right? But we don't. And so you get very conservative fundamentalist scholars today who will point to that and say, see, women are not supposed to be speaking to church, right? And they say, you don't have any evidence to show that wasn't in there, right? All the manuscripts have it, right? And so you get this debate among scholars over whether Paul actually wrote that couple of sentences in 1 Corinthians, or whether that's a later addition. So I wish we had some hard evidence, right? But it's, yes.
I did work on Colossians, which is attributed to Paul,
Yes.
as in writers.
Right.
And he has the household code with, dad's on top, mother,
Yes.
children, servants, slaves.
Yeah. And
So,
we have that in Colossians and in Ephesians. And so you have this household code, which is just straight out of Roman secular writing, right? And of course, most scholars today think that were Ephesians, but they have these household codes, which are Roman hierarchy for the household, right? The man's on the top. The woman is supposed to obey her husband. The children are supposed to obey their parents. The slaves are supposed to obey their masters, right? And so it's all in there. So we have, very uncomfortable for many modern Christians, we even have 2 letters attributed to Paul in the New Testament, which condone slavery.
I think Paul's
Right.
gotten in trouble mistakenly for this.
Yeah.
And
And so-
bothered me.
Yeah, and so we can see, in the generation after Paul, that could be a whole different class where we look at where those letters came from, right? In the generation after Paul, you're already getting this pushback, right, against women's leadership, and you've got things like those household codes. They're in large part meant to put women in their place.
Well, what about
Right.
women having to have their heads covered? Where'd that come from?
That's in 1 Corinthians 2, and I actually wrote a paper in seminary that one day I might just publish that, because I don't think that had anything to do with veils.
We could all wear our hats.
Huh? Well, the thing is, the word for veil is not actually in that passage, right? It's a phrasing, and think thinking, well, we talked about space here, hairstyles in the world. Have you seen statues of women? Do they have their hair hanging down free? They don't, right? They have these elaborate hairdos, but the hair's not hanging down loose, right? That was referred to as binding your head, right? But putting the hair up and tying it into to these hairdos, that's binding your head. What Paul says is a woman should have her head bound. Right? And so I think what he's talking about is actually that women are showing up in church with their hair down, which has a very negative connotation in Roman society.
As a prostitute.
And prostitutes do this. Right? You see, and so I think what's going on in that passage is that really he's not talking about veils at all, because we don't have any real evidence that Roman women wore veils at the time of Paul. You go back 300 years and they did. Right? But at Paul's time, were they doing that? And so the evidence is really not very strong. And so I think it's more likely that they're talking about hair and not, and then the comment about men begins to make sense. In that same passage, he says, a man should cut his hair, right? He shouldn't have long hair hanging down, right? And so if you understand it this way, that he's addressing the same issue with the men and the women. It's about their hair.
I think you need to publish that paper, Michael.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I have to go back and find it. But anyway, if he's talking about hair, then he's being consistent. He's saying, women, do what's culturally expected with your hair. Men, do what's culturally expected with your hair. Don't send the wrong message by showing up to our public worship with things that have negative implications for larger society.
I don't like this very much. I'd rather be upset with Paul.
Well, we still could be over this because he's saying, I mean, if you think about it, he's saying, look respectable according to whom? Right? According to the dominant culture. Exactly. Right? Yeah.
I guess I'm defending Paul. You don't want to stand up for the wrong thing. Right?
Oh, yeah.
I think you're more powerful, more likely to be heard, and you're not being consigned as a prostitute or thought of as.
Yes. And his defense as well, he does say Christians should stand out from the larger culture. I mean, that's in Paul too, right? They shouldn't look at you and see you. That's the whole thing about eating meat offered to idols. Let's back up and look at that one for just a second. This is not in the slide presentation, but Paul has a fit over that, right? Why are you doing that, right? Well, if you think about it, where are you going to get your meat in the ancient Roman world? Where do you get meat? You go to the market. Where did the market get that meat? The slaughterhouses of the time were the pagan temples. Right? That's where the marketplace got the meat, right? They do these animal sacrifices at the pagan temples. The priests aren't going to eat all of that. You've got large numbers of people bringing the sacrifice. So where do those sacrifices go? They go to the marketplace. They get sold in the marketplace. The money in the marketplace gets part to the merchants and part to the pagan temple. Right? So this is financially supporting the pagan temple if you're eating meat offered to idols. Right? It's supporting that. Also, where are you going to eat that meat? Right? If you take somebody, and a lot of the members of the early church were poor. Now, we had some very powerful, very wealthy members of the early church too. It's not all poor people, but those poor people, there's no place to entertain their house. Where are you going to take a guest? Where are they going to go if you're going to share a meal? You're going to do their public restaurants. Guess where they are? They're on the portico of the pagan temples. Right? So if you're going to take somebody out to eat, you're going to go to McDonald's? The McDonald's of the ancient world was the pagan temple. Right? Huh? What? McDonald's is the pagan temple. Yes, but very literal. in the Greco-Roman world, that's the public eating place. That on that temple, there's a patio area, right, where people gather to eat. And you're eating the meat that was sacrificed in there. So when Paul says, if somebody sees you doing that, they wouldn't see you if you were in your house, would they? Right?
There were prostitutes there in the temple.
There were, not in the temple, but in the marketplace, yes. You know, and so, but in the, well, and that depends on the temple. Sorry, there are, yes, some of the temples had that, right? Well, that could be a whole issue too of the different Greco-Roman religions and the role of prostitution in some of them.
And the hair was shaved or-
Yeah. Mhm. And so, but when Paul says that about eating meat off your time, idols, a big part of his concern is people are going to see you and they're going to think you support that pagan temple. Because where are you eating that meat? Right? If you're doing it in public, you're doing it at the pagan temple, right? And if you're doing it in your home, you're still supporting the pagan temple, right? We read that passage and we don't realize that what Paul's saying to them is you're just going to have to not eat meat a lot of the time, right? You're going to eat meat when you've raised the animal, right? Or when you know who did and you know it hasn't been through that temple, right? Because that's the only way you can eat meat and not support the pagan temple. And it's the only way that you can eat meat together with friends and not do it at the pagan temple, right? And so this is an issue, a cultural issue for Paul. The issue is don't be like the surrounding culture, right? Be different, right? Don't eat meat, right? Don't go to that pagan temple for that purpose, right? Don't buy that stuff in the marketplace, right? And so he, on some issues, he was very much like, Christians have to look very, very, very different from the culture around them.
So did he say all this in letters?
Yes, right. That all of that about the meat offered to idols is in 1 Corinthians, the same place we saw earlier. Right? So in 1 Corinthians, he has a section deal, and we read through 1 Corinthians and we tend to just skip that chapter altogether because it seems to have so little to do with our modern lives. I mean, who's eating meat offered to idols? So it's just not in the lectionary, right? And so we just skip over it. And but it's in there, and if you read straight through 1 Corinthians, you're going to get to this really almost 2-chapter long discussion of not eating meat offered to idols, and it's right back to back with that issue of the women and their hair and the men, the haircuts and all that. It's right there in that same section of 1 Corinthians. So anyway, so we've got Paul saying, don't be like the surrounding culture, but sometimes do, right? Don't do things that's going to make them think you're a prostitute or make you think you're a pimp, right? If you're one of the men, right? Don't do that, right? Be careful. The optics are important. They're important when we should look like the culture around us, and they're important when we shouldn't. Right? And so it's complicated, right? Okay, so we got Christianity legalized. Whoa, we're behind. I want to get to what happened to prophets. Epiphanius he's famous for writing one thing. He wrote a whole bunch of things, but one of his works is the thing that he's most known for. He wrote something that in Latin, he wrote it in Greek, and in the you notice the time, he's in 300s, dies right just after the year 400, so the 4th century, right? And he writes a book that the Latin version is going to be against heresies, right? The Greek version is the bread basket.
And again,
The bread basket, the panarium in Greek is the bread basket. And what happens when you have a bread basket, right? It's not just one piece. You've got many, many, many thrown in there. And that's the way this book is organized, right? You've got one little chunk here, another chunk here, another chunk here. It's like a bread basket, right? And so the title was actually the Pananium, right? And so the breadbasket. Now he wrote that work against heresies. Now, some of this, scholars catch really lightly on this. They say we have to be very, very careful because there's some stuff in there that is definitely historical. There's some stuff in there that the only evidence we have for it is that Epiphany said it, and we can't find a scrap of evidence anywhere that it ever happened. Right? And so how much is because he's criticizing something real, and how much is something that he's essentially making up to malign one of these early Christian groups, right? And so it's hard to pull apart. But this work would become incredibly influential in the early church. And anything that smacked of one of these pieces of bread, right, was going to be he called them heresies, right? They're going to be treated that way. What he's doing actually is writing about competing groups in early Christianity. And he'll label them, the Origenists, the followers of Origen, right?
Did he do this on his own, or did he have his partners?
Well, he was an important church leader, and he was fighting for what became the Orthodox Christian movement. Right, and he wrote against. Remember our Montanists before?
Mm-hmm.
We get that term because of him.
Mm-hmm.
Right? He lumps all of these people together and he says those are the Montanists. They're wrong, right? And he, we'll look at how he goes about that in just a second. So he's writing against the heresies. He uses two images to malign, if you will, each of these groups, right? He refers to the groups as the concubines, right? The concubines of whom? The church is supposed to be the bride of Christ, not the concubine of Christ. You see how that is? So all these other groups, the Orthodox movement, that's the bride of Christ, right? These others are concubines. Right? Now he picks a passage from Song of Songs, which refers to the character having 80 concubines. How many heresies is he going to list?
How many?
Exactly 80. Right? He quotes this passage from Song of Songs, in which it refers to the bride and the 80 concubines. Right? He's going to find 80 heresies, even if he has to make up a few of them. Right? And so he's going to there's some that we just don't hear a thing in the world about, except Epiphanius and many scholars think, oh, well, of course, there was nobody that believed that. It was just something that he's trying to fill out the number. Right? And so, we get this. He will also use the image of beasts. Right? Remember that beasts are on the natural side, not the civilized side. Right? So these movements they're sometimes the beasts, they're sometimes the concubines, right? And by the way, what is a concubine? In his argument, a concubine is an uncontrolled woman, right? She doesn't inherit, she doesn't have any ultimate obligation, right, to this family. She's just an add-on, right? And so he's going to use those two images, concubines, which his society is growing more toward monogamy, right? And so their concubines are a negative thing; they're not supposed to be there, right? And so these variant groups are concubines of Christ, which has a really funky, strange thing of what is he implying, But anyway, he maligns them in that way. They're concubines, they're beastly, they encourage immorality because they act like beasts. Is this actually true? Did they actually do that? Right? But that's the accusation that he makes against them.
Were 80 of these Christian groups?
What?
80?
80 different groups. right? And he'll give each one a name, right? Like the Montanists, he'll name them, and he will accuse them of sexual immorality, of that beastly act, and he will refer to as the Montanists as one of the concubines, right? And so he writes that work, even though it is really, we read it today and we're really uncomfortable with the way he's arguing, right? It becomes really, really, really influential in the development of the early church, right, in the 4th century. And so you get, again, this negative view of women connected to those heretical movements. Right? What?
It's still with us today.
It's still with us today. And you're going to get, with Epiphanius, the final end to there being prophets in the early church. Right? Up until this time, it's a thing that's losing momentum as it goes forward. They're getting fewer and fewer, but he kills them at this point. And so you get an end to that by the year 400. And so you suddenly get this view, the view that the Orthodox view, the Orthodox view is that prophecy is something that happened a long, long time ago, right, in the ancient world, and God doesn't use prophets anymore. Right, and we get this distinction. So we end up with where we are today. People who are preaching, but nobody does prophecy. Right, where we end up in the Orthodox movement. And the last time that bell just meant that we're out of time. Right? And so again, we're going to end up with something, but at some point we ought to do something on what happens to the church at the fall of the Roman Empire. I think we think of the fall of the Roman Empire as something that happened at a specific point in time, right? What actually happened is, to begin with, the Roman Empire never fell. The Western Roman Empire fell. The Roman Empire in the East continued all the way up into the 1200s, right? And so it's the Western half that we're looking at, but it is an incredible disaster, right, for the Christian communities at the time, because many of them lose everything, right, in this. And so we'll look at at some point we'll need to do a class on that. What happens to the church now that the empire is gone? The infrastructure is gone. The economy that the Roman Empire supported simply vanishes. Once the political structure is gone, there's nobody to run that economy anymore. The church is going to have to step in, right, for people to rescue people literally from starvation. The churches are going to have to step up and say, we're going to provide something. We're going to be the engine, right, that drives the economy. We're going to be the engine that drives the civil discourse, if we will. Somebody has to step into that gap. And that's going to have a real transforming influence on the church too, right, in very powerful ways that are going to further limit the roles of women as the church moves into that role of being the economic and political structure after the empire is gone. And so we'll talk about the fall of the empire. You can get up to Charlemagne and the 10th century. We'll have to do that another time. But thank you so much for being here. I know reruns are not the it's fun, but it's the second time we've done this, but I really appreciate you coming. And those of you who are joining us online, I appreciate it. We'll see you later.
I just, a little pause, I learned the little bird whispered in my ear that it's Burla's birthday.
Happy
So,
birthday.
Happy birthday. Yes.
Happy birthday.
67.
All right. Well, happy birthday.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you for being here. See you later.
Every